So we're lucky today to have two people from industry with us, and Bola from Vanguard. But Sue Cantrell is from Deloitte. She's the Human Capital Eminence leader and Vice President of Products, Workforce Strategies at Deloitte. I have a little bit of a bio, if you don't mind, if I would like to read around Sue. She's a leading expert on the future of work in human capital and developer of solutions that help organizations harness digital technologies. She also is a co-author of the Harvard Business Press book, Workforce of One, and she holds a Master's of Science degree in Management Information Systems from Boston University and an undergraduate degree from Vassar. So welcome, Sue. And then also to her left is Michael Vennera, and he's the Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy, Corporate Development Information Officer at Independence Health Group. This is one of the, it's okay to say it's part of the Blue Cross Blue Shield group here in the Northeast region. And during nearly his 25 years at Independence, he's held leadership roles in informatics, information systems, operations, innovation, and has overseen numerous technology initiatives. He's a graduate of Penn State down the road, Penn State University, and earning a bachelor's degree in English and a master's degree in information systems. So welcome to both of them. So as we wait for our other panelists, I'm going to get started on some of these questions that we had talked about. And as you know, there's many academics here and some industry folks as well. There's PhD students. So what we would like to focus on is strategic implementation. Could you share a successful example of how AI has been implemented in your organizations that is enhancing the customer experience? And potentially, what are the key challenges that leadership or the employees have to overcome? If you guys could just start off with one of those examples.
Sure, I'll start, and I guess good morning. It's still morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here. So I think you can look at a couple examples, and I think any time we talk about AI these days, you sort of have to speak of Gen AI and then everything that came before it. We've got numerous, I'd say, successful examples of deploying predictive modeling capabilities, really around resource optimization, things like identifying high-risk pregnancies, identifying people who are likely to be hospitalized, those types of things to direct some of our clinical outreach programs, right? A health insurer often has nurses on staff that will call up members to keep them out of the hospital, right? Make sure they're taking their meds, that sort of thing. So that's something we've successfully deployed really for a number of years. But if you fast forward to Gen AI, which I think probably what we want to talk about a little bit more, it's right, kind of the exciting topic. These days, I'd say we're still, I think like a lot of large organizations, still in a phase of piloting and trying to deploy something. So, we're hoping we're going to have a successful implementation, but we're not there yet. And what we're doing with generative AI is really, I'd say there's really two areas we're kind of moving forward. One, I think, is relatively straightforward. It's, enabling some of our application development team with code assist and code generation. That's a pretty straightforward application. I won't talk about that much. But the one that's maybe more interesting, and I think, one of the presentations earlier had talked about, a conduit for knowledge management. It kind of falls into that vein. A health insurer often has lots of documents that a customer service agent has to be versed in. So there are benefits which might vary by, by product. When you get up to large employers, right, every employer may have their own custom benefits. You also have then medical policies that are more sort of global, and that you often have to apply the intersection of those in responding to a member inquiry, right? Whether a certain procedure is covered, whether it's covered in this particular setting, that sort of thing. So we spend a lot as an organization, and I think all insurers do, on an area like customer service. It's a people-intensive, cost-intensive area. Lots and lots to learn. It's probably the area we invest the most on a per-employee training basis, and it's also unfortunately a high turnover job, right? So you end up with an organization that has a large customer service team, a large team that you spend a lot on, that you spend a lot to train, and you have to train them often because you're often replacing the individuals. So really the thought is, can we apply and what we're working on is applying a generative AI application and really grounding it in our policy and benefit documents. We're working with a Google Vertex. It's kind of our platform that we've chosen, and really see if we can have a conversational interface into our benefits and policies, right? And the idea is that we will call it something like an agent assist, right? So the idea is, if you're a customer service agent, you're talking to a member, you have a question, you can't remember, don't know the answer, rather than, well, I'll go look it up and I'll call you back, right? Can you use this interface to sort of get an answer more quickly or more efficiently than you would otherwise be able to get it? So, that's something we're working on now. We're piloting it, but and hopefully maybe next year or sooner I'll be able to say it's a successful implementation. But that's the thing we're working on and are most excited about in this space.
That's very exciting. Sue, do you have anything
Yeah.
you want to chat
I'll share one of my favorite examples. I mean, oftentimes with AI and generative AI, we talk about improving productivity. And one of an interesting examples was that I studied in my research was a technology manufacturing firm, and they went after productivity in a kind of different way, right? They didn't squeeze more out of working hours. They didn't monitor workers with AI to see if who was carrying their weight and who wasn't. Instead, what they did was they used AI wearables combined with a mobile app to measure worker happiness, and then used AI to make suggestions on how to improve it. It was opt-in, right? And what they found was that productivity improved. Human outcomes improved. They measured psychological capital. It's basically self-confidence and motivation improved. 10% improvement in profits, 34% improvement in sales per hour in their call centers, 15% improvement in retail sales. So it's just an example of some of the shift in thinking that we've had at Deloitte around kind of beyond productivity, which I think is a challenge in terms of measurement. Because when you think about, at least at the worker level rather than the macroeconomic level, when organizations think about worker productivity, think about inputs and outputs and measuring activities, right? But they're not thinking about outcomes, which is a very different thing than activities. So we've talked about this new equation that we call human performance, which is measuring business outcomes. So in like a call center environment, it might be customer satisfaction or upselling, rather than number of calls or calls per minute. And human outcomes, which would be things like, have you learned more skills? Do you have greater employability? What's your well-being? Do you have meaning at work? And then they multiply one another. So trying to get at metrics when you're using AI that we call are beyond productivity, because those productivity outcomes and inputs and outputs kind of started in the industrial era, and work is more complex when machines are automating what's easy, and maybe we should measure what we should, not just what we can. And there's all this stuff in the media about productivity paranoia, and with AI kind of observing people as they work, and then you have things like mouse jigglers on the market, right, in response to it, and all this productivity theater. So I think one of the challenges to overcome is just, are we getting the metrics right? And I think that example I showed was a nice example of measuring human outcomes and business outcomes.
That's a really good opportunity for everyone here to also think about, as you said, this when we were in the industrial era, and it was productivity, but now we have the capability of measuring all these other aspects of the human experience within work and understanding how important that is to the adoption. There was a talk in here just a bit ago, and it was about that profit, and it wasn't clear that AI deployment was really going to, in the end, bring a lot of these employee, to profit, because some employees were, just basically transferring their motivations in doing that. So very well put.
Yeah, if you don't mind, one maybe response to that. I would think that there are certainly different types of metrics, right, sort of for an organization, and all the way, and you can almost think of them as on a hierarchy, right? There are sort of certainly activities that people in any organization are performing. There are sort of outcomes of those activities, and then there are higher and higher level business outcomes, right? Ultimately to your firm's profitability or market share, right? Right. Really high level metrics that have tons and tons of inputs. So, one of the things I would think, though, on the sort of the productivity versus non-productivity thing, I think Some of that is not a new problem with AI. It's sort of just an older, you're measuring the right thing, right? If I think back to the example of the call center, right? One of the things I think a lot of organizations measure is, your average speed of answer, right? How fast can you pick up the phones, or what's your average handle time? How long does it take you on the phone? Well, those are both important to measure, but not if you're getting lousy outcomes, right?
Yeah.
If you're quick on the phone, but you've got an unhappy customer, or the customer has to call back multiple times, and that's certainly not a good outcome. So we complement with things like first call resolution rate, right, which is on your first call, is the problem that the individual called about resolved during that call, or looking at callback statistics, like how often does an individual have to call back into the call center. So I think it is a mix of different
It's
metrics.
why we call it beyond productivity,
Yeah.
because it's not saying we're replacing productivity.
Right.
It's beyond productivity, and we need to be careful about that. And then the other point is that with AI, we have all these new sources of data that we didn't have before. Like in call centers, we can have AI observe, an interaction with a customer,
Sure.
and quantify things that we didn't have metrics for before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the only reason I wanted to just kind of point out that that's important too, because a flip side of that, right, is you also have the CFO, right, who's saying, okay,
Yep.
we want to make these investments in AI, like where's the return, right?
Yep.
And for a lot of businesses or a lot of applications, like the example I was talking about, it's fairly far removed from revenues or profits, right? So you often are justifying it with, well, I'm going to be able to reduce costs, right? Which then ties you back to productivity metrics. So there's also in any large organization a question of how you fund and get organizational investment
Right.
around these things. So that's just another important piece of the puzzle that has to be addressed.
Absolutely.
All right, we have our third panelist that has joined us. Bola, thank you so much. Bola Ajayi.
Ajayi, not bad.
Ajayi. All right. And Bola is the head of data science and machine learning at Vanguard. He's earned a Master's of Science degree of Math from the University of Rhode Island.
Correct.
And so I'm going to start you with a new question, and
Awesome.
if that's okay, because you kind of came in at that.
Yeah, although it was
question.
an interesting, I was listening in.
It was,
Quite
it was,
the top.
but I thought it was, so one of our next topics is around reskilling and upskilling metrics. So in the context of an AI-driven workplace, what strategies do you believe are most effective for reskilling, upskilling employees, and potentially how does Vanguard measure that success?
Yeah, first of all, the reason why you want to upskill or reskill is because, in particularly AI, is doing more of the decision making for you, right? So in the past, if you were used to, like, let's say you're a sales consultant, and you kind of rely on your spreadsheets and all the information you have in front of you, you're synthesizing that information, and you pretty much know exactly how you're going to talk to client X or Y, who you're going to talk to, when you're going to talk to them. But in the age of AI, that's actually helping you to do that in a more optimal way. It's looking at a lot more data than you can look at as a salesperson or as an individual. But there is a psychological component to that, right? If you have agency to say, I'm the one that's doing the sales, I'm the one that's driving the value, and now you have this sort of outside agent that's, helping you, and in some cases directing you towards those goals. That change management is part of that, right? You're changing your mindset. So when we think about upskilling, it's about becoming it's not just, hey, we don't expect folks to be experts in AI, but we want them to understand how it works, how it shows up in their work, how it may affect them, how it can actually drive them to do more. So the thought of upskilling is really just basic understanding of what data science is, what it's not. Things like when we talk about machine learning, what does that actually mean? When we talk about large language models, what is that in relation to machine learning and so on? So a lot of education around just what AI is. A lot of education about why it's important, for example, to have clean data. I think in the past, you say, hey, this data is for me, I'm using it to drive my value as an individual contributor. Now that data, even the data that you generate, becomes part of the knowledge base that others may use to get better as well, particularly through AI, because it's going to use that information. And then that information now drives value, and there's this sort of iterative effect that you get from AI. But as an individual contributor who doesn't know, if I didn't know that, then I would just think that my data is my data, and I wouldn't necessarily care as much about the quality outside of my need. So a lot of education around how do I understand the technology that is AI, what kind of tools and methodologies are implied in that. And I think the most effective way, again, is not necessarily to bombard folks with, here's a neural network, and here's how it works, and this is how you train it. I don't think that that's the level at which you start to drive value across your business. What Vanguard has done is thinking about the level that you're at, right? So leaders need to know. What do leaders need to know? Where would AI actually drive innovation and or capabilities such that you can drive more revenue or reduce costs? Leaders need to know that so they know where exactly to plug in that AI. And so that's the training that we do oftentimes for leaders. For crew, we call crew, Vanguard calls the employees crew. But for crew who aren't in building AI models, we try to train them in understanding what AI is and making sure that they understand where it may play in the future for them, so that they're not intimidated or feeling like there's a lot of this may take my job that comes out of it. Believe it or not, that's important to help them understand and get context as to what this is, because if you don't, then there's resistance, and that resistance leads to inefficiencies in being able to achieve goals. So for crew that are not doing AI/ML, it's more just making sure that you recognize and understand what it is. And then for crew who are doing AI/ML, and I have the teams of folks that are doing that, the training is more along the lines of all of the new innovations that are happening, because this space is moving super fast. And so you need a conduit through which you can ensure that folks are working on the right types of capabilities, knowing what the new ones are, knowing when one may be obsolete, because that's an important piece, right? I would say in the last year, there's certain things that were state of the art at the beginning of the year. Nowadays, it's old hat, right? So making sure crew that's working with AI/ML understand and have a conduit to learn and understand how this space is playing. And then finally, for those who are at the top of leadership, the training is very much focused on understanding what industry practice is in this space. And I was interested in what Mike was saying earlier when I first came in, because he was talking about use cases that, I'm in asset management, and a lot of the same use cases are there. So senior managers absolutely need to understand that this is not something, there are capabilities that are not just for asset management or just for, health services or just, it's very ubiquitous. And then understanding where those tools and those capabilities play is another part of that training as well.
Well, thank you for kind of giving that overview of upskilling and reskilling across the whole organization. And I guess I'm going to flip it to you, to Sue and Mike. And given that overview that Bola said, and that you have all these researchers out here, what do you, in either of your organizations, what do you need more research on to be more confident around efficient or effective upskilling or reskilling? Can you think of areas in which that you don't have that research, or that you're kind of shooting in the dark, given that this is such a new technology, but there's such high costs to invest in it? And to Bola's point, what was relevant a year ago is out of date now to you. Well, not out of date, but not as what'd you say, old hat or something?
Old hat, yes.
Old hat.
I actually think it's really important, AI literacy, upskilling and reskilling on new tasks that are going to need to be done as jobs are reconfigured. But I think sometimes organizations miss that a huge component of reskilling and upskilling is this premium that is now placed on uniquely human capabilities. Things like empathy, problem solving, imagination, and we have a deficit of them, right? We don't know how to measure them, how to operationalize them, yet they're becoming so important. I mean, just with Gen AI, we need to be able to ask the right questions, continually iterate with it, So I think that's one area where I think we need more research and more attention. And I noticed that because we're so focused on the AI literacy component, that we miss that. And I think that's actually possibly more important. The other piece I'd say is that with generative AI, it's a different thing than previous versions of AI or technology. Everybody has access to it. It's democratized for the first time. So I think that where I've seen a lot of success in upskilling and reskilling is giving people like what we call at Deloitte digital playgrounds, AI sandboxes, generative AI sandboxes where they can experiment, play, try it out in a safe space, and then really co-create how their job is going to change. And as part of that, reskilling will happen naturally in the flow of work.
Yeah, I would just one or two comments on kind of what Bola overviewed, and then I'll make it, then I'll kind of address kind of the question around what additional research we look at. I think two things, I would add to what Bola laid out. I mean, one, I think it's a technology that lends itself to, and I hate this term, but I think that's the best one I can think of, is sort of an evangelist, right, within it, or an organization, or for different areas. So, every big organization has different sort of functional disciplines, right? A finance team or a marketing team or a operations team, and having people embedded within those teams that are spending more time, on AI literacy than the general workforce, or spending more time playing around or getting exposed to things, is going to be important, because they're going to have insights in how to apply this technology in their, functional area that, someone in a sort of a data science team or sort of in a central corporate function is not going to be able to have. That'd be one thing. The second thing I think that's important, and we've talked about as an organization, is, well, I think, the natural thought is you want to think about sort of all the great things AI can do. You also, I think, want to have people that are grounded and understand the adversarial uses of it, right? So you think about, one thing I'll just kind of throw this out there as sort of a question, right, that I've thought about is, a lot of organizations have historically published a lot of documentation on public websites. So to use as sort of a not for my industry example is, if you're a appliance manufacturer, all your manuals are typically, out there. Well, that's great, right? When it was an individual searching for how do I, fix my dishwasher, but do you want someone with an LLM, right, pulling all that stuff into is that different? Is that fundamentally different if someone can ground an LLM in all of your documentation? Do you now need to rethink about, well, should I make that stuff publicly available, or do I need to put it behind some type of login, right, to sort of block it from being crawled by an LLM? Just sort of questions like that. So understanding adversarial use cases for whatever your business is probably as important as thinking about sort of the positive use cases. And then I think in terms of the research.
Stop you for a second.
Yeah.
So are you saying that is an important educational aspect?
Yes.
To educate your employees
Yes.
around all these possibilities, and that
Yeah.
it's, when you say democratize, it's like democratize that it's everyone's responsibility in the organization to identify that? Or
Right, sir. Right. I think well, people in their relevant disciplines to just understand how it can be used. So in an example, again, I'll come back to our business that we've worried about and luckily really haven't seen a lot of yet is, we are in the business of, paying claims. There are often times, right, where something's maybe not covered, right, and, there'll be a request to cover something, and then we'll do a medical review, and then sometimes, if it's medically necessary or covered, right, there's a process to kind of go through it. So it's one of the more painful parts of health insurance. Well, what happens, we've thought about, is when, someone sends in a letter, summarizing why, something should be covered, and cites a lot of medical, literature, some of which is hallucinated. Like, do you spend the how do you think about spending the time to go through that, right? In the past, you would have gone through and looked up the medical citations and seen, well, maybe there's something that we weren't up to speed on that was newly published around, that would make us say that, yeah, this is a applicable technology for this condition. We should approve the claim. But, now with the ability of LLMs to create realistic-looking hallucinations, like that's a risk. Right? So you just have to understand that that's a possibility, if you're in that role of reviewing sort of, coverage decisions. So that's what I mean by just understanding the potential adversarial use cases. And I think every business has different adversarial use cases it could face. I think back to the where you started, right, with the research questions. I think, research, and I think the very last presentation before this really, piqued my interest. I mean, just the intersection of how you deploy AI into the workforce and how it intersects with things like, incentives and, those types of things is, I think, an area I think industry can learn a lot of, because I think what we tend to do is, just roll out an incentive, like with an incentive program, like roll something out, maybe not a ton of science, or just because someone else did it, and then, does it work, doesn't it work? We're not as good at, I think, at least we're not, I think a lot of industries not as, measuring and putting more science around that. So I think that would be one area of opportunity.
Okay, thank you. So the next question we're going to talk about, and you helped us lead us to it, Mike, is around ethical considerations. So what ethical considerations do you think are imperative when implementing AI and used by your workforce, especially around what we talked about, data privacy and employee surveillance? And it's going to be a little bit more of a lightning round, so keep that in mind when you're giving your answers. Who wants to start with that? So employee surveillance and data privacy.
Yeah, I'll go. We can go this way. For us, when we started our Gen AI roadmap, we started with a set of principles, right? I think for us, it's always that there's an accountable human, right, in the loop, and making it, is accountable for a decision, even if it's supported by AI, and that, we're promoting things like fairness and making sure that we're not propagating, any type of systemic bias. There's some of the things that we really focus on from an AI, fair, or an AI principle standpoint.
An aspect of this is that there's a lot of data generated now by workers as they work that can be ingested by AI, and I think it can be a gold mine for both workers and for organizations, but also a landmine in terms of AI surveillance and data privacy breaches, right? And regulations are not enough. They just can't keep pace. So we've done a great deal of research on how organizations need to develop their own frameworks of responsibility. A couple, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but a couple principles would be things like opt-in, make it opt-in when possible, give to get, meaning always give benefits to workers as well as to the business. So it should never be used for punitive consequences or for surveillance. Aggregate and anonymize the data when you can. Make some data private, because transparency does not always equal trust, like many people assume. So there's a whole body of work there. And then I think you voiced some of this, Mike. I think there's all these IP issues we need to pay attention to with generative AI. So who owns the art when it's generated by AI and humans, or whatever it is generated? And when workers' expertise is baked into algorithms, and then it's scaled, their expertise is essentially scaled. Can't we reward them for some of their expertise when now it's available to everyone? It raises a lot of ethical questions.
Hard to add to that, because
That was great.
yeah, I think between Mike and Sue, they pretty much nailed the gambit. If I can add a few things really quickly, lightning round. AI models are black boxes, unlike traditional models where you can understand where some of the predictions are coming from. AI, for the most part, you don't really have that insight into why a prediction came up. So it adds an extra onus on the inputs, checking to make sure that the inputs are proper, and then also that the outputs are proper. So human in the loop is a big one, right? And even when you remove the human in the loop, there has to be checks and balances, whether automated, or we could say the human checks certain aspects of it prior to it being disseminated. So obviously it causes problems in terms of automation, because then it's hard to scale something like that. But on the input side of the house, again, this idea of the data that goes in then is paramount. You need to make sure, right, no personally identifiable information is there. You're masking things that could otherwise be an issue. And then also, if you're looking at a ton of documents, you want to make sure that there's consistency in terms of what each document is saying relative to any question that could be asked to it. So a lot of hallucination comes from the fact that you have documents that actually conflict, right? So from an ethical perspective, you need to make sure the inputs are sound in terms of what it's saying about different ethnic groups and or age groups and so on and so forth. stuff you could control in the past, now you have less control. And then, like I said, the outputs likewise need to be sound and made sure to be sound before you send it out to sort of an external party.
Well, you guys did great on that round. I love it, especially ending with the data. I mean, we can't do anything without having good data there. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience, but I'm going to leave one question for the end for you guys to just do. We talked about this long-term vision that you guys might have on AI. So here we go. Christina, you raised your hand. Go ahead.
Yes, so in our survey of manufacturing firms, we looked at the barriers to AI use. This was pre-Gen AI. And leading barriers were cost and lack of use case. And so I'm curious, in your non-manufacturing settings, what are the key cost drivers that would slow down deployment of AI in production? So this is not experimentation. And if that's too much, the thing I'm most interested in is how do you learn about the use cases? Like how do you figure out how to actually put the AI in a particular task or a process that you hadn't used it in before?
So I think for they're kind of related questions. So I think on the cost side, that's not really been an issue for us, right? I can only speak to my organization for this. But the use case part has been a little bit more challenging. And I think it goes a little bit to kind of when Bola was describing sort of the, getting people up to speed. Like we had an executive that was said, I'm confident we can answer any question. I'm not confident that we're going to get people asking the right questions. Right. So it's getting the organization, people, because again, the centralized group can't think of those use cases. It's got to be the line or functional leaders or organizations that do it. And then two, having the right, again, back to what our business, having the right intervention. So, we've done I mentioned some really great work on being able to predict people that are, have undiagnosed diabetes was a model we worked on a number of years ago. And our data science group is really proud of it and thought it was great. And then and it was, right, sort of scientifically, if you will, it was a really good model. But then our clinical lead was like, well, what am I going to do with this? Like, am I going to call someone up and say, you might have diabetes? Now, I think he was a little, kind of, a little bit too much of a naysayer, but I think that's the challenge is really having the right, having a use case really requires those functional or line, leaders to understand what they can do and then actually make a change. I sometimes call it the last mile problem, right? It's like, AI can get you so far, but a lot of times it is, if there's a human or some other intervention at the end, like it sometimes runs into problems there.
Just a very quick echo, completely agree that it needs to come from the business rather than like a centralized group. And even more than just like a leader of a business unit or the like, I've seen a lot of success in just, as I said before, co-creating and involving workers. To your point, like understanding what it can do, and then let's figure out what are the most important, highest value, abilities we can apply it, because sometimes even leaders in the business don't fully understand the details of the work. So we've seen a lot of success with just involving workers and co-creation to identify those best use cases.
Real quick, Christina, quick story for you that should bring home the points that I think Marcus made perfectly. What we did in Vanguard was actually try to crowdsource the use cases. So we went to the business and said, hey, let us know. Here's this Gen AI stuff. Please let us know based on, we gave them a little sort of primer on how it works and then said, give us the use cases that you think fit with this. What we got back were tons of use cases, but a fraction of them actually was amenable to AI, right? And the rest could have been done with basic analytics, and so there was this lack of understanding again of what AI was very specific to AI versus sort of more general analytics, and that was actually what primed us on this idea of data literacy. It was because we realized they didn't make a mistake. They see all this promise, they just didn't understand where that all sit relative to other analytical tools that we have in our toolbox. And then really quickly on cost, I also agree that for the most part, cost doesn't play a role yet, right? But sitting on within IT, I understand compute costs will be an issue down the road. I'm predicting that because a lot of folks are saying we want this now. There is a cost incurred when you have large language models in particular that are running against all this data, and you have to think about the opportunity, or you have to think of the cost of that relative to some alternative. And right now, that's not always thought of, but over time, you have to pay the piper, right? This compute cost is there, and it has to be considered in your overall budget over time.
Yes.
Just want to follow up on, first, thanks for all the insights. Bola, you talked about the different kinds of training, different kinds of people. And Michael, your point about using it in a context of the customer agents and your business learning. I was wondering, certainly Gen AI is a space where we have less control, don't understand much. What are you doing with giving that comfort space for the employees that things could go wrong? And and you talked about accountability, right? So it has to be, at the organization level. Are you doing something that incentives, allowing for that failure, giving them that space? What do you?
So just to repeat the question, I think it's around accountability, making employees aware of accountability, but allowing them space to utilize the tool. Did I summarize that? Okay, go ahead. Bob, you want to go?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on that really quick. So I think it was Sue that made the point around sandboxing, right? So this idea of having some place where you can incubate your ideas, right? Have at it, bring all the data you want is very protected space. But you have to build that. Not every company has that. But I think in this current age, it's absolutely important to just have you can't break it bad enough to ruin the company space for you to innovate. That being said, also hackathons have become more and more part of the culture. This idea of bring your best and greatest ideas. We will enable you, again, creating these environments, creating these sandboxes where you can go and innovate. And what's cool about, especially with generative AI, is that it's much easier to build a functioning chatbot or similar than it was to build pretty much any other AI tool in the past. To the point now, I think in an afternoon you could probably do a decent job of it. So again, just enabling that environment where folks can fail fast, as they say. And once it's vetted and it looks like it's going to work, then the hard job of the governance, like there's model governance to make sure that everything is working properly. You have to control for inaccuracies, hallucinations, and so on. But first things first, give folks a space to innovate, and then from there, take that idea and see what you can do with it.
I'm going to go to another question. Zuming, did you have one?
Excellent panel. Thanks for the insights. I think Michael mentioned one thing very important about the cost center, and I think also apply to Vanguard and many other corporations. The earliest adoption of AI and Gen AI is really the cost center, because now the customer service reduce the cost center really roll out all these chatbots and these other LLM to drive down the human costs. So my question is twofold. The first one, have your companies really roll out technology, the chatbots, you lay off some people in terms of the composition? The second part is, do you see the employees you retain, have they have more creativity or new process because technology help them? Have they contributed new ideas, new solutions for customer service problems in the call centers?
Yeah, so a couple answers to that. So first, I'll answer the second part of the question. So we're not there yet. As I mentioned earlier, we're building towards this. We don't really have it sort of deployed widely. So I don't think we're at the point of sort of talking about the employees that are left, right, and sort of what that does. I think ultimately the cost question, and I agree with Bola that the cost of Gen AI is going to become a problem at some point. I think every organization, just because this is such a transformative technology and there's so much buzz about it, everyone's just kind of spending on it now. It was just kind of like you got to jump in and you got to do something. But eventually, right, that the CFO is going to come knocking, or the country's we're going to get into a recession, and it's going to be like, hey, you've got to show some hard benefits. So I think for a lot of these technologies that are automation oriented, like ultimately the hard dollar benefit, right, or the short-term benefit, right, will come from reduction in labor costs, right? I think that's sort of the hardest and easiest to get. I think what we'll typically see, like I mentioned, our deployment in customer service. Customer service is a high turnover area, so I wouldn't expect us to deploy something and let people go. I think we would deploy something and then be able to just sort of reduce our hire rate, right, of new employees, so that over time you would reduce your labor costs that way. But I think ultimately for a lot of these technologies that are deployed in a, internal setting, right? I think it's different if you're talking about an externally facing sort of revenue generating opportunity, but a lot of these sort of internal, essentially automation, right? Use cases are ultimately going to be about, they're ultimately going to have to be justified in the near term by reduced labor costs.
Real quick, I just wanted to make one point of correction. The use case that was most obvious wasn't so much the call centers, but it was chatbots themselves, right? When you think when ChatGPT was launched, it was a chatbot. So immediately, folks who have worked on chatbots said, "Oh, this is it. This is going to solve all my problems." I think pretty much everyone has used a chatbot that just wasn't great, right? So you can imagine folks' eyes sort of popping out of their head when they see something that's talking in, back to you in a very human form. So that was really the first use case that I would say a lot of businesses thought, hey, I can improve that. And then from there, of course, call centers is a close follow-up to that.
Because that chatbot was actually being used within the call center to help make them more efficient.
Absolutely.
We have time for one more question.
There's a hand back there.
Okay. Cornelia?
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating question for Sue, please. I'm very happy to hear about the transition from input versus outputs towards a more holistic understanding of outcomes. You mentioned that you used, or that variables were used to measure happiness, and I was wondering what type of metrics did you use?
What type of metrics did you use to measure happiness?
Oh, so this was, I'm a researcher, so this was a case study, right? And they used, they had wearables where they measured unconscious body movements, interestingly enough. Now, I want to say something with a caveat, which is one of the really important things that we suggest, is that you really want to make sure you're measuring what you intend to measure. Because there's a lot of technology out there that will say, like facial recognition is a good example, that research has shown facial recognition doesn't actually statistically accurately pick up emotions, right? So you want to be really careful about that. So that was one example. I think the bigger point I was trying to make is that because of AI, we have all of this data that was not previously available to us, and that we can now measure things beyond productivity in really simplistic measures. And I think the way to get to this is that, productivity was like one size fits all, standardized, right? And to get to more nuanced outcome metrics, I think you were starting to go here, is that it needs to be much bigger than like profit or revenue growth. It has to be at the workforce level, at the industry level. It's going to be varied. It's going to be more nuanced, and it's going to be a little bit more sophisticated, because the same. I'll just give an example with call centers. Yes, because we've been talking a lot about that. Yes, we need to measure, calls, minutes per call, and number of calls, and the like. But can we measure things like upselling, how happy, customer satisfaction, and those are outcomes that are not so high level, but that are really going to vary by workforce, and then how AI can enable us to have new sources of data to measure those. So that was the broader point I was trying to make.
Well, and just based on what you said, I heard you say more nuanced, more sophisticated, and we have, many sophisticated researchers out here that can tackle those problems. So
Absolutely.
That's great. So we'll continue to have these type of forums. We're going to close out. I'm going to give you each 60 seconds for your final comments, and you can comment on this or something else. But looking ahead, what is your long-term vision for the intersection of AI and human work in your organizations, or your opinions, individual opinions of that? So what do you think is a long-term, everything's happening so fast. So if you could think, 18 months out, which is probably long. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say we're effectively using AI in a way that helps us, achieve our, goals, right? Which is really, for us, taking care of our members and their health, so ultimately that's the goal. If it helps us do better, right, then that's what we want. Right, and I think having a happy workforce, I like the happiness measurement, is as part of that deployment. That's that would be a win as well.
That's good to know. Sue?
I'll try to be fast. I think 4 things. From a tech side, the natural language interface, I think that was mentioned yesterday, right? Like voice, gesture, all of that is going to change everything. Two, what I call in my own mind is digital doppelgangers, and I think it was mentioned yesterday too, where we're going to have our own AI assistants, our own, it's going to be highly personalized to us, and the lines are going to blur in terms of what's your expertise versus a corporate asset, and it raises all kinds of IP and rewards issues. Three is the need to reinvent organizations and work, not just do the same things faster or more efficiently. And then we were chatting about Wharton's own Ethan Malik. I don't even know if he's in the room, but I read a really great Sloan Management Review article by him that was published just 2 weeks ago, and it made me start to think about this made very well. I mean, we've been thinking a lot about how it's reinventing jobs, but it's going to reinvent the org structure and the way organizations function entirely.
A lot of work needs to possibly look at what that's going to look like in the future and how AI is going to change it. Bola, thank you, Sue.
Yeah. So again, a lot of my thoughts were also just said. I'll add to. There's a lot of talk around co-pilots, right? That's a term, and I do see this idea of co-pilots. AI working very closely alongside human intelligence, basically growing over time, and folks getting more comfortable with it, and to the point where it takes sort of human creativity, human productivity into heights that we've never seen before. I think we're seeing the starting points of that, but I think that accelerates in the next 2 to 4 years easily. The second thing that comes to mind is around, and this is my own sort of personal hope, is I don't know if folks have taken anything like management science or operations research, but I'm a big optimizer, right? And there's a lot of data that just sits there on a shelf unused, and I always say that there's information in this thing, right? That's always my mantra. There's information, we just need to extract it. I think AI and ML is making it very easy, it's making knowledge much more attainable within that data that we didn't have before as well. So I can imagine sort of mankind as a whole just getting sort of much more informed, because the data, again, whether you're speaking or writing or doing anything human and natural, those things don't just sit or fly into the ether and just disappear, but they actually are recorded, and you can actually extract that information. That's amazing. To me, that's absolutely going to be a game changer, not just for industries, but I think for the world. So I'm bullish on that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that summary. I want to thank our panelists, Mike, Sue, and Bola. If we all could give them a round of applause.